Jake Reynolds sat quietly in the corner of the Blue Wave Cafe, watching life happen around him. The morning sun poured through the windows, lighting up the steam from his coffee cup. His wooden cane leaned against the table, a constant reminder of how much his life had changed. At 35, Jake looked older. His face told stories even when he stayed silent. Deep lines around his eyes showed years spent squinting in harsh desert sun. A small scar above his right eyebrow hinted at dangers he'd faced. But it was his eyes that gave away the most. They belonged to someone who had seen too much. 6 months ago, Jake had moved to this small coastal town of Pinewood. Nobody knew him here, and that's exactly what he wanted. After 15 years as a Navy SEAL, anonymity felt like a luxury he'd never had before. "More coffee, hon?" asked Rita, the cafe owner, a kind woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a loose bun. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you," Jake replied with a polite nod. As Rita filled his cup, she glanced at his cane. Jake noticed. He always noticed when people looked, but Rita was different. She never asked questions. She just smiled and moved on, treating him like any other customer. Not everyone in town was like Rita. Jake had felt the stares from the moment he arrived, the whispers, the pity, or worse, the awkward way people pretended not to notice his limp at all. His right leg ached this morning. The doctors had done their best, but some wounds never fully heal. 3 surgeries and months of physical therapy had gotten him walking again, but the Navy doctors had been clear. His days as an operator were over. Medical discharge, 2 words that had changed everything. Outside the cafe window, Jake watched a group of fishermen head toward the pier. They moved with an easy confidence, joking and laughing. Once Jake had moved that way too, with his team. Before the mission in that unnamed valley, before the explosion that tore through his leg and killed 2 of his brothers, Jake took a sip of coffee, pushing the memories away. His therapist at the VA had warned him about isolation. "Reconnect," she'd said. "Find something that matters." Easy words from someone who'd never had to rebuild their whole identity. A family walked into the cafe, mom, dad, 2 kids bouncing with energy. The younger boy, maybe 7 years old, stared openly at Jake's cane before his mother gently redirected him. Jake didn't mind the kids' curiosity. Children were honest at least. He opened his worn paperback, an old Tom Clancy novel he read 3 times already. Reading had become his escape in the hospital, then during rehab. The familiar stories were comforting, even if some of the military details made him roll his eyes. His phone buzzed. A text from Mike, one of the few teammates who still checked in regularly. "How's civilian life treating you? Ghost?" "Coast." His old call sign. Jake stared at the nickname, remembering how he'd earned it during training, moving so quietly through water that instructors couldn't track him. Later, in combat, the name took on new meaning. Jake was the one they sent when someone needed to vanish silently into enemy territory. The quiet professional. The shadow. Now he was just the guy with the cane. He didn't answer Mike's text. What would he say? That he spent most days sitting in this cafe. That he still woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. That sometimes he missed the danger because at least then he'd known his purpose. Jake sighed and returned to his book. A group of loud men entered the cafe, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere. Jake recognized them immediately. The local construction crew led by a big guy named Derek. They came in most mornings, filling the small space with their booming voices and rough laughter. Jake didn't look up. After years of assessing threats in the world's most dangerous places, these guys barely registered. But as they passed his table, one of them knocked against his cane, sending it clattering to the floor. "Watch your stick, buddy," the man said with a smirk, not bothering to pick it up. Jake simply reached down, grabbed his cane, and went back to reading. In his previous life, things like this mattered. Now he was just trying to find peace in his coffee, his book, and the quiet rhythm of a small town that didn't know who he really was. Some battles weren't worth fighting. At least, that's what Jake told himself as the construction crew's laughter echoed through the cafe. Derek Chambers slammed his truck door shut and spat on the gravel parking lot. Another Monday morning, another week of taking orders from his old man. At 38, he still worked for Chambers Construction, the company his father had built from nothing. The old man never let him forget it either. "Let's get moving," he barked at his crew as they climbed out of their own trucks. Tom, Pete, and Hank had been working with him for years. They weren't exactly friends, more like drinking buddies who knew better than to cross him. "Man, my head's killing me," complained Pete, rubbing his temples. Last night at the Rusty Nail Bar had gone late, as Sunday nights often did. "Should have stopped after the 5th beer," Derek said, no sympathy in his voice. "We got the Wilson job to finish today. Dad's already on my case about being behind schedule." The mention of Derek's father changed the mood instantly. Everyone knew how hard the old man was on his son. 20 years ago, Derek had been the star quarterback at Pinewood High, his future bright with scholarship offers and small-town glory. Then came the knee injury during the state championship game, and everything changed. No college, no escape from Pinewood, just decades of working for his demanding father while watching his old classmates move away to bigger things. "Hey, isn't that the guy with the cane?" Tom nodded toward the Blue Wave Cafe across the street. Through the window, they could see the quiet newcomer sitting at his usual corner table. Derek squinted. "Yeah, that's him, Mr. Mysterious." He'd noticed the guy around town for months now. Something about him rubbed Derek the wrong way. Maybe it was how people seemed to give him space, treat him with a kind of respect that Derek felt he'd never gotten, not since his glory days. "What's his deal anyway?" Hank asked. "Never says much to anyone." "Probably some city guy who thinks he's too good for us," Derek said, his voice hardening. "Did you see how Reba at the cafe fawns over him?" "More coffee, hon." He mimicked Rita's voice, making it high and flirty. The others laughed, eager to stay on Derek's good side. "Maybe he's faking it," Pete suggested, nodding toward the cafe. "You know, with the cane. I saw him get up once, and he didn't seem that bad to me." Derek felt a flash of anger. He hated people who played for sympathy. His own knee still ached when the weather changed, a constant reminder of what he'd lost, but he never asked for special treatment. "Let's grab coffee," Derek decided suddenly. "I need something stronger than that gas station junk." The crew followed him across the street, their work boots crunching on gravel. As they entered the cafe, Derek made sure to stand taller, his presence filling the small space. This was his town. He'd been born here, starred on the football field here, and now he built the houses and fixed the roofs here. Who was this outsider to come in and act like he deserved special attention? Rita greeted them with her usual smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, boys." "The usual." "Yeah," Derek answered for all of them. His eyes drifted to the corner where the stranger sat reading. Something about the guy's calm bothered him. Like nothing in this town could touch him. While waiting for their coffees, Derek leaned against the counter, speaking just loud enough for his crew to hear. "You know what bugs me? People who use their problems to get special treatment." He glanced meaningfully toward the corner. Tom and Pete chuckled, but Hank looked uncomfortable. "Dad always said you can tell a man's character by how he handles tough times," Derek continued. "Some people use their bad luck as an excuse. Others just deal with it." When Rita handed them their coffees, Derek made a point of walking past the stranger's table on their way out. As he passed, he bumped the table slightly, making the man's coffee slosh. "Whoops," Derek said with a smirk, not bothering to apologize. The man looked up briefly, his eyes meeting Derek's. For a split second, Derek felt a chill. There was something in those eyes, something hard and assessing, that didn't match the quiet exterior. Then the moment passed, and the stranger looked back down at his book. Outside, Pete slapped Derek on the back. "Did you see his face?" "Didn't know what hit him." Derek laughed, but it felt hollow. For some reason, those eyes stayed with him as they headed to the job site. There was something familiar about that look, the same calculating gaze he'd seen in his father's eyes all his life, measuring him and finding him wanting. Content greater than rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Bar and Grill, turning the Thursday evening dark and gloomy. The neon beer signs cast colorful reflections on the puddles forming in the parking lot. Inside, country music played from the jukebox, nearly drowned out by the buzz of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. Jake hadn't planned on going out. His leg was bothering him more than usual, the damp weather making the old injury throb. But after spending all day in his small rental house, the walls had started closing in on him. Sometimes the silence was worse than the pain. He'd chosen his usual corner table, the one with a clear view of both the entrance and the back exit. Old habits died hard. The waitress, a friendly woman named Nancy, brought him a burger and fries without him having to order. After 6 months as a regular, the staff knew his preferences. "Weather's awful tonight," Nancy said, setting down his food. "You picked a good night to let someone else do the cooking." Jake smiled, genuinely appreciating her kindness. "Thanks. I wasn't in the mood to heat up another can of soup." At the bar, he spotted Derek and his 3 friends, already several beers into their evening. They were louder than usual, celebrating something. Jake had learned to tune them out, the same way he'd once tuned out the noise of helicopter rotors during mission briefings. Jake was halfway through his burger when the door swung open, bringing in a gust of rain-scented air. A young couple hurried inside, shaking water from their jackets. The man held the door for the woman, his hand gently guiding her through. Jake looked away, feeling a sudden, unexpected pang of loneliness. Before his last deployment, there had been someone, Kelly, a nurse he'd met during training in San Diego. They'd talked about a future together. Then came the explosion, the surgeries, the months of recovery. She'd visited him in the hospital twice before the calls stopped coming. Jake didn't blame her. She hadn't signed up to care for a broken man with nightmares that make him scream in his sleep. From the bar, Derek's laugh boomed louder than before. Jake glanced over to see the construction crew starting their 4th pitcher of beer. Their voices carried across the room. "Think he owns the place," Derek was saying. Sitting there with his fancy coffee and his book, like he's better than everyone. Jake realized with a jolt that they were talking about him. He looked back down at his plate, not wanting to make eye contact. Years of training had taught him when to engage and when to stay invisible. This wasn't worth his energy. But Derek had other ideas. As Jake reached for his water glass, he became aware of movement. The construction crew was making their way toward his table, weaving slightly from the alcohol. "Well, look who it is," Derek announced, loud enough for everyone in the bar to hear. The mystery man himself. The background chatter in the bar quieted. From the corner of his eye, Jake saw Nancy pause behind the counter, concern on her face. He kept his expression neutral, taking another bite of his burger. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore people when they're talking to you?" Derek planted his hands on Jake's table, leaning forward. The smell of beer was strong on his breath. Jake set down his burger. "I'm just trying to have a quiet dinner." His voice was calm, controlled. "A quiet dinner," mimicked Pete, one of Derek's followers. "Listen to him. Thinks he's too good to talk to us locals." Jake said nothing, which seemed to irritate them further. "What's wrong with your leg anyway?" Derek demanded. "You hobble around town like you're something special." The bar had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching, but no one moved to intervene. Jake had seen this before, the bystander effect. People didn't want to get involved in someone else's trouble. "I'd like to finish my meal in peace," Jake said quietly. Derek's face flushed red. "Oh, you would you?" Without warning, he knocked Jake's cane from where it leaned against the table. It clattered to the floor, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. "Oops," Derek said with a cruel smile. "Handicapped parking is outside, buddy." His friends laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Even drunk, they seemed to sense they'd crossed a line. Jake looked at his fallen cane, then up at Derek. For the first time, he allowed his mask to slip just slightly. His eyes, usually carefully guarded, now held a coldness that had made enemies in foreign lands tremble. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Derek's smile faltered as something in Jake's gaze registered even through his alcohol-muddled brain. The silence in Murphy's bar and grill was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was fixed on the corner table where Derek Chambers stood over Jake, the fallen cane between them on the floor. "What did you say to me?" Derek's voice had an edge of uncertainty now. Something about the way Jake was looking at him had pierced through his alcohol-fueled confidence. Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I said you might want to pick that up." Each word came out measured and clear. Derek glanced at his friends, looking for backup. They shifted uncomfortably, suddenly interested in their beer bottles. The challenge had seemed fun when it was 4 against 1 and the target was just a quiet guy with a disability. Now, something had changed in the air, and no one could quite put their finger on what it was. Or what? Derek tried to sound tough, but his voice cracked slightly. "What are you going to do about it, Gimpy?" Jake didn't move. Not a muscle. Not a blink. It was the stillness that was most unnerving, the kind of stillness that comes from thousands of hours of training to remain motionless in hostile territory. "You know what I can't stand?" Jake said, his voice still calm. "Bullies who never grew up. Men who peak in high school and spend the rest of their lives trying to feel big by making others feel small." A few people at nearby tables nodded slightly. Everyone in town knew Derek's story, the football star whose career-ending injury had turned him bitter. "You don't know anything about me," Derek snarled, his face reddening. "I know enough," Jake replied. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. The movement was smooth, controlled. He slid out a worn ID card and placed it on the table, face up. "Take a look," he said simply. Derek stared down at the card, confusion crossing his features. Then his eyes widened as he read the information. His mouth opened, then closed again without making a sound. "What is it?" asked Tom, one of Derek's crew, peering over his shoulder. When he saw the ID, he let out a low whistle. The card identified Lieutenant Commander Jacob Reynolds, United States Navy SEALs. Even in the dim bar lighting, the official insignia was unmistakable. "You're..." Derek couldn't seem to finish his sentence. "I was," Jake corrected him, "for 15 years. Nancy, the waitress, had edged closer, listening. "My brother was in the Navy," she said softly. "He said the SEALs were the toughest of the tough." Jake didn't acknowledge her comment. His eyes stayed locked on Derek's. "That leg you're mocking." "I lost part of it pulling 3 Marines out of an ambush in a place I'm still not allowed to name. 2 of my teammates died that day." His voice remained level, but there was something underneath it now, a depth of experience that no one in the bar could truly comprehend. The color had drained from Derek's face. He looked like a man who'd stumbled across a sleeping lion and accidentally kicked it. I didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't ask," Jake replied. "Too busy assuming, weren't you? Too busy thinking I was less than you because of this." He gestured toward his leg. The bar remained silent. Even the jukebox seemed to have paused between songs. "Now," Jake continued, pointing to his cane on the floor. "You going to pick that up, or do we have a problem?" Derek swallowed hard. The alcohol buzz that had made him so brave earlier seemed to have evaporated. Slowly, he bent down and retrieved the cane. When he handed it back, his hand was visibly trembling. "Sorry," he muttered, barely audible. Jake took the cane, his face unreadable. "I don't want your apology. I want you to think about why you felt the need to target someone you thought couldn't fight back." Derek stood there, swaying slightly, as Jake's words sank in. Behind him, his friends had already started backing away, pretending they'd never been part of the confrontation. "My team had a saying," Jake added, placing his ID back in his wallet. "It's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the fight in the dog. Remember that next time you think about judging someone based on what you can see." He picked up his burger and took another bite, as if nothing had happened. The message was clear. The conversation was over. Derek turned and walked back to the bar on unsteady legs that had nothing to do with alcohol. The normal buzz of conversation slowly resumed across the room, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone was sneaking glances at the quiet man in the corner, seeing him with new eyes. By the time Jake paid his bill and left Murphy's that night, the rain had stopped. The wet streets reflected the streetlights like mirrors, and the air smelled clean and fresh. He took his time walking home, his cane tapping rhythmically on the sidewalk. For the first time in months, his steps felt lighter. He hadn't meant to reveal his past. The ID card was something he usually kept hidden away with his medals and photos, but something about Derek's bullying had struck a nerve, not because it hurt him, but because it reminded him of what his youngest teammate had faced in training. Brian had been small for a SEAL, constantly underestimated. He'd died saving Jake's life in that ambush. Back at his small rental house, Jake sat on the porch swing, listening to the dripping of water from the gutters. He wondered if he'd have to pack up and leave town now. The quiet life he built here might be over once word got out. It didn't take long. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Jake's phone had 17 text messages from his former teammates. Somehow, they already knew. "Way to stay under the radar, Ghost," read one from his old squad leader. Jake shook his head, amazed at how fast news traveled. He didn't need to ask who had spread the story. In a town like Pinewood, last night's drama at Murphy's would be the talk of every coffee shop and grocery store checkout line by dawn. When he finally worked up the courage to head to the Blue Wave Cafe for his usual morning coffee, Jake immediately sensed the difference. Conversations paused when he entered. People nodded at him, some with newfound respect, others with curiosity. Rita, the cafe owner, set down his coffee with a small smile. "On the house today," she said quietly. Jake started to protest, but she waved him off. "My nephew's a Marine. He made it home from Afghanistan because of men like you." All Jake could do was nod his thanks. As he settled into his corner table, his phone buzzed with another message. This one was from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Chief Bill Harmon, Pinewood Police. There's some folks here at the station who'd like to meet you when you have time. No rush." Jake stared at the message, confused. The police? What could they want? His question was answered 2 hours later when he walked into the small police station on Main Street. Chief Harmon, a stout man with salt and pepper hair, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming in," the chief said, leading Jake to a conference room. "Got some people who've been wanting to meet you." Inside the room sat 3 men of varying ages. The oldest, well into his 70s, stood as Jake entered. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap, his back straight despite his years. "Lieutenant Commander Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "Bob Wilson, Army, 1968 to 1971. The second man rose more slowly, leaning on a prosthetic leg visible below his shorts. "Dave Cooper, Marines, Afghanistan, 2009 to 2013. The third and youngest simply nodded. "Tyler Mills, Army Rangers, got back last year." Jake looked at the chief, confusion evident on his face. Chief Harmon smiled. "Turns out we've got more veterans in Pinewood than anyone realized. They just tend to keep quiet about it, like you did. After what happened at Murphy's last night," he shrugged. "Word spreads fast in a small town. We meet for coffee on Wednesdays," Bob explained. "Nothing formal, just veterans talking to other veterans. Thought you might want to join us." Jake felt something open up inside him, a door he'd kept firmly shut since his medical discharge. These men understood what others couldn't: the nightmares, the adjustment, the loss of identity. "I'd like that," he said simply. Outside the station afterward, Jake paused on the sidewalk, watching the town go about its normal day. A group of high school kids laughed at the ice cream shop across the street. An elderly couple walked hand in hand, taking their time. A delivery truck backed up to the hardware store, horn beeping. Ordinary life. The kind of life he'd helped protect for years. Maybe it was time to become part of it again, not just an observer. As he turned to walk home, Jake noticed Derek's truck parked outside the diner. Through the window, he could see the construction worker sitting alone, staring into a coffee cup. Their eyes met briefly before Derek looked away, embarrassment clear on his face. News had spread indeed. Jake's quiet cover was blown. Now he had to figure out what that meant for his future in Pinewood. 3 weeks after the incident at Murphy's, Jake sat at a picnic table in the town park, watching kids play baseball on the dusty field. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he sipped coffee from a travel mug. His regular Wednesday meeting with the other veterans had just ended, and he wasn't ready to head home yet. The weekly coffee gatherings had quickly become the highlight of Jake's routine. For the first time since his discharge, he could talk with people who understood, really understood, what it meant to come back from war and try to build a normal life. No explanations needed. No awkward questions to dodge. "Mind if I join you?" Jake looked up to see Rita from the cafe standing there, holding a paper bag from her shop. "Please," he said, gesturing to the bench across from him. She sat down and placed the bag between them. "Thought you might like a muffin. Fresh baked this morning." "Thanks," Jake said, surprised by the gesture. Rita watched the kids playing baseball for a moment. "My late husband loved this time of year. Baseball season. He coached the Little League team for 15 years. Jake nodded, unsure what to say. Rita rarely talked about personal things during his cafe visits. "He was Army," she continued. "Desert Storm. Never talked much about it." "We usually don't," Jake replied quietly. She smiled sadly. "I know. John, my husband, he had a hard time when he first came home. nightmares. Couldn't stand fireworks on the 4th of July. But this town helped heal him. She looked directly at Jake. It can heal you too, if you let it. Before Jake could respond, an elderly man approached, walking his golden retriever. He stopped at their table. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, removing his cap. "George Phillips. I just wanted to shake your hand, son. My grandson is a Marine, stationed in Okinawa right now." Jake stood, shook the man's hand. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." As George continued his walk, Rita smiled. "That's the third person this week who's stopped you, isn't it?" Jake nodded, still getting used to being recognized. "Word travels fast here." "Small towns," Rita said with a shrug. "For better or worse, there are no secrets." She hesitated, then added, "Did you hear about Chambers Construction?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "No, what about it?" "Derek's company is offering a job to Dave Cooper, you know, the Marine with the prosthetic leg you met at the police station. Apparently, they need someone to manage their office, handle the scheduling. Dave's been looking for work since he moved back last year." Jake stared at her, surprised. "Derek's idea?" Rita nodded. "From what I hear. He came into the cafe yesterday morning, ordered his usual coffee, but he seemed different, quieter. Asked me if I knew any veterans in town looking for work." Jake watched the baseball game in silence for a moment, processing this information. He hadn't seen Derek since that night at Murphy's. The construction crew still came to the Blue Wave Cafe for morning coffee, but they'd switched to earlier hours before Jake arrived. "People can surprise you," he finally said. "Sometimes they just need a wake-up call," Rita replied, standing up. "Enjoy the muffin. I should get back to the cafe." As she walked away, Jake noticed a woman heading toward him along the park path. He recognized her as Lisa Chen, the high school principal. They'd met briefly at the grocery store the week before. "Mr. Reynolds," she called. "I hoped I might find you here. Do you have a minute?" "Of course," Jake said, gesturing to the bench Rita had just vacated. Lisa sat down, smoothing her skirt. "I'll get right to the point. Our history teacher, Mr. Franks, is organizing a special assembly for Veterans Day next month. He asked me to invite you to speak to our students." Jake felt a flash of panic. Public speaking had never been his thing, even before the injury. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," he said carefully. Lisa smiled. "That's exactly why you are the right person. These kids hear about war from movies and video games. They need to hear from someone real." She paused. "Someone who's faced adversity and kept going." Jake looked across the park. A young father was teaching his toddler how to throw a ball, the child's laughter carrying on the breeze. This was why he'd done what he did all those years, for moments like this. "I'll think about it," he promised. Lisa stood satisfied. "That's all I ask. Let me know by next week." As she walked away, Jake realized his phone was buzzing. A text from Bob, the Vietnam veteran. "Still on for fishing Saturday?" Jake smiled as he texted back. Wouldn't miss it. 3 months ago, he'd been a ghost in this town, present but not seen. Now, somehow, he was becoming part of its fabric. The thought both terrified and comforted him. 3 months after the confrontation at Murphy's, Jake stood backstage in the high school gymnasium, his heart pounding harder than it ever had during combat missions. He adjusted his tie for the 5th time and took a deep breath. "You look fine," said Bob, the Vietnam veteran who had become something of a mentor to Jake over the past weeks. "Stop fidgeting." "I'd rather face enemy fire than 300 teenagers," Jake muttered, making Bob laugh. The gymnasium was packed for the Veterans Day assembly. Through the curtains, Jake could see rows of students filling the bleachers, teachers standing along the walls, and a section of chairs near the front where local veterans and their families sat. He spotted Rita from the cafe, Dave Cooper with his prosthetic leg, and even Chief Harmon in his dress uniform. 5 minutes, Mr. Reynolds," the school principal, Lisa Chen, said as she hurried past, clipboard in hand. When Jake had finally agreed to speak, he'd imagined talking about courage or service, the usual Veterans Day themes. But as he prepared his notes, a different message had formed, one he hoped might actually reach these kids. Principal Chen took the microphone at center court. "Today, we're honored to welcome Lieutenant Commander Jake Reynolds, a decorated Navy SEAL who now calls Pinewood home." The applause was polite but curious as Jake walked to the podium, his cane tapping against the polished floor. He placed his notes down, looked out at the sea of young faces, and set the paper aside. I had a whole speech planned, he began, his voice carrying across the quiet gym. About heroism, about service, but that's not what I want to talk about today. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Instead, I want to talk about failure, and fear, and getting back up when you fall. A few students who had been slouching in their seats straightened up, surprised by this unexpected opening. Before I was a SEAL, I failed the entrance fitness test twice, Jake continued. My instructors told me to quit, said I wasn't built for it. He smiled slightly. I graduated in the top 3 of my class. Jake leaned against the podium, taking weight off his injured leg. The strongest people I've ever known weren't the ones who never struggled. They were the ones who struggled and kept going anyway. His eyes scanned the crowd and landed on a familiar face in the back row. Derek Chambers stood against the wall, arms crossed, listening intently. Their eyes met briefly before Jake continued. When I got injured, I thought my life was over. I'd lost my team, my career, my purpose. For months after I moved here, I was just going through the motions. Existing, not living. The gymnasium was completely silent now, every person focused on his words. Then something happened that forced me to remember who I really was. Jake didn't elaborate, everyone in town already knew the story. And I realized the strength that got me through SEAL training didn't disappear when my leg was damaged. It was still there. I just had to find it again. Jake spoke for another 15 minutes, sharing stories of teammates who had overcome incredible odds, of civilians in war zones who showed unimaginable courage, of the quiet heroes he'd met right here in Pinewood who fought private battles every day. The strength isn't in never falling, he told the silent crowd. It's in rising again when you do. When he finished, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Students and teachers rose to their feet. Several of the veterans wiped tears from their eyes. After the assembly, as the gymnasium slowly emptied, Jake gathered his notes and was preparing to leave when he noticed Derek approaching hesitantly. Got a minute? Derek asked, his usual swagger nowhere to be seen. Jake nodded, and they moved to a quiet corner of the gym. That was good, what you said, Derek began awkwardly. About failing and getting back up. Thanks, Jake replied, unsure where this was headed. Derek looked at the floor, then back at Jake. I wanted you to know, Dave's working out great at the office, and we're starting a program for veterans, construction training. Jake raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. My old man finally let me take over some of the business decisions, Derek continued. Figured if a guy can handle military service, he can handle building houses. There was a moment of silence between them, not comfortable, exactly, but not hostile either. That's good, Jake finally said. Really good, Derek nodded. Anyway, there's a position open. Supervisor for the South Side Development. If you're interested. He held out a business card. Could use someone who knows how to lead a team. Jake took the card, a small smile forming. I'll think about it. As Derek walked away, Bob appeared at Jake's side. Was that who I think it was? Jake nodded, looking at the business card in his hand. People can change. Some need a bigger wake-up call than others, Bob observed with a wry smile. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, the first of the season. Jake stood on the steps of the high school, watching the flakes drift down, melting as they hit the pavement. A year ago, he'd been fighting for his life in a hospital bed, uncertain if he'd ever walk again. 6 months ago, he'd been a shadow in this town, hiding from his past and afraid of his future. Now, for the first time since the explosion that changed everything, Jake Reynolds felt like he was exactly where he needed to be.